much, Kendra, for having us, and thank you all for being here today as well. Kendra and I were talking before we started about the sort of the 2-year build up to this event. And I've been working on another conference that had this similar situation of like, we're going to do it and then everything caught on fire. And now we're so excited to be doing it. So I bring that enthusiasm and that excitement to this discussion today. I'm really happy to be having these conversations and introducing this resource that I'm really passionate about and I think can be really powerful and transformative for open education in a lot of different ways in terms of the resources we make and the pedagogies that we bring to bear as well. What I thought I would do over the next 45 minutes or so is lay a little bit of a foundation in terms of why fair use and related copyright exceptions are really critical as sort of a parallel set of opportunities that we have to the Creative Commons licenses that we often know so well when we do this open education stuff. Talk a little bit specifically about the way codes like this one have been useful for people trying to take the often perceived as confusing fair use work and put it into practice, introduce the code itself, spend a little time talking about how we can apply this code in particular disciplines, institutions, consortia, and that sort of thing. And then I'm going to do my level best to leave some time for questions and discussions, because uniformly that's the best part of any presentation I've ever been a part of. So please do add questions in the chat anytime. And certainly at the end, I'd love to take some time to say that I'm excited about this, I'm confused about that. I'd like to talk more about that as well. So without further ado, without any more throat clearing, let's jump into it a little bit and talk a little bit about sort of the core thesis that created this project in the first place. And that core thesis is that for open education and open educational resources to be as good as they can be, as powerful as they can be, as invitational and equitable as they can be, we really need to rely on the full suite of opportunities that are created by the legal systems that we exist in. If I were to say something like the public domain, I suspect a lot of people have heard that phrase before. You know, those are works that were never protected by copyright in the first place, maybe because they're ideas that the law says are universal and everybody should have access to, maybe because they're works that are old enough that they're not protected anymore. But the idea of the public domain is a sort of a resource for creating OER that a lot of us are familiar with. And there are some amazing OER creation programs that draw on library special collections, for example, resources that are out of copyright and in the public domain and everybody can use. Likewise, I suspect if I started talking about the Creative Commons, everybody would sort of politely nod their heads because we've all talked about the Creative Commons in the past, that set of licenses that open up works that are protected by copyrights. That's an area that we understand as critical towards making and sharing and then sort of 5R remixing, et cetera, the open educational resources that we create. The third area, though, and an area that I would argue is just as important as the other two, has been in the past a little less discussed, maybe because it's been less understood, maybe just because it seemed intimidating people, but for whatever reason, we have talked a lot less in the open education community about the way that copyright exceptions, particularly fair use, can permit us to do the sorts of things that we really need to do if we want to do the good sort of pedagogical stuff and publishing stuff that's central to the work that we're doing in open education generally. And the reason that I argue that fair use is really central to this stuff is because open education is not a closed book exam. In other words, the best way to make a resource is not to just lock yourself in a room and only include whatever it is that's in your head or a friend might have given you permission to use. There might potentially be a few disciplines where it's possible to create a pretty good resource in that way. But in most cases, when we create open educational resources, we need to engage with the world we live in and the lived experiences of the students and instructors that are participating in that work, with the work that's come before, whether or not it's been openly licensed. We need the power that fair use gives us to build resources that are connected to the whole world and the whole set of experiences that people have had. Not just to these sort of smaller universes of really old stuff or stuff that has been openly licensed in some sense. These notes at the bottom here that all sources and types of materials are eligible, that fair use allows all sorts of normal activities like quotation that we do every day in other contexts, I think are important to keep in mind that fair use isn't as sort of academic as some people tend to think of it and it's often not as confusing as people tend to think of it as being. Instead, fair use is something that all of us rely on every day in our day-to-day lives. So I hope I can persuade you that you shouldn't be intimidated by it or uncertain about it, that it's something that's there as part of the stuff that we want to and know we need to do in our educational practices. I think that's particularly important to not limit ourselves artificially to just sort of the old stuff or just the Creative Commons license stuff for a variety of reasons. Part of creating the code is we do a whole bunch of interviews with individual stakeholders and then focus groups with groups of people and talk to them about what they're able to do, what they wish they could do. And these themes on the left here are themes that have shown up over and over again, that when we don't rely on fair use, when we refuse to rely on that sort of thing, we can't do the sorts of things we need to do to support students with disabilities in different ways, right? The pandemic has given us a crash course on everything from, making works accessible and all the ways that we know how to do that, to questions about the digital divide and that sort of thing. But if we limit the tools in our toolbox, a lot of our students, and particularly the most marginalized and vulnerable students, are the ones who don't have equal access to the resources that we create and share and use. There's also a core sort of sense of mission risk that comes along with the choice to not rely on fair use in different ways. We just can't make resources that are as good as we ought to be able to do it. And we should be aware that commercial publishers are very comfortable relying on fair use in a lot of different contexts. So if we set ourselves in the open education community as a community unwilling to use that particular tool in the toolbox, we're really setting ourselves up at a disadvantage to the other resources that faculty and students might choose to use. So those risks, I think, are really important. I also want to put a sort of a highlight on this notion that we've talked about in some spaces, and that I've alluded to a little bit as sometimes it's called the disappearing 20th century or the 20th century black hole. This is the idea that works before 1920 or so that are in the public domain are free for anybody to use, right? And so open educational resources are often built on the public domain stuff. And works that were created in the past 10 to 20 years or so, when there was a Creative Commons as a system that people could use, are often fairly well reflected in the resources out there, right? The old stuff and the very, very new stuff. But there's this gap in the middle where copyright still applies, but there wasn't yet the sort of body of practice called the Creative Commons for people to use to openly license their stuff. And a few people have gone back and said, yeah, I wrote that paper in 1980 and I'll put an open license on it now. Most people, of course, have not done that. So refusing to engage with fair use leaves us vulnerable to this sort of 20th century black hole. It also leaves us vulnerable to the fact that new and recent events happening often don't get a Creative Commons license put on them right away, right? If there was a big news story last week and I want to bring in newspaper coverage of that, the newspaper probably hasn't put a CC license on it, and any scholar writing an academic work about it, it's going to be a year or so before that gets published. So we leave ourselves vulnerable both to that 20th century black hole, but also to what we might call like the last couple of months black hole as well. So there are a lot of risks to not relying on fair use in terms of the folks that we're serving well and less well, and in terms of the resources that we can incorporate as well. So that's the problem statement: enter fair use and the sets of best practice. So I said a moment ago that fair use is a copyright exception, and I probably should have said that fair use is sort of the copyright exception for education and for the work that we do in that space. Fair use has a long and venerable history. It's been in the courts for more than 100 years. It was written into the 1976 Copyright Act, and since then it has sort of emerged as the first best way for educators to think about engaging with stuff that's happening in the real world, the materials that make up the subjects and the topics that we want to talk about in different ways. Because it has this venerable history, some people sometimes feel intimidated by sort of, how do I actually apply fair use? I've heard about this thing, fair use, but I don't really know how to use it. And if you sort of set yourself the task of reading every judicial opinion on the topic and then digging into the statute and the statutory history and everything else, that would feel pretty daunting. The good news, though, is in the mid-1990s, the Supreme Court made this pretty easy to do. The Supreme Court, in this really, really important decision called Campbell v. A.Q. Froese, said all that stuff you've heard about and read about with fair use can basically be synthesized into this core question about transformation. Are you taking this third-party work and bringing it in to do something new or different, to comment on it, to critique it, to use it to illustrate a different sort of argument, that sort of thing? And if your use is what the courts would call transformative, are you using the appropriate amount? And what the court said in Campbell and what the court reaffirmed this year in Google versus Oracle and what courts have said consistently throughout all that time has been, yeah, that's the first question to ask when you're talking about fair use. If your use is transformative and you're using the appropriate amount, ta-da, it's fair use and it's probably okay to use without worrying about getting permission or these other sorts of things as well. So this framework of transformation, grounded in particular in this question of doing something new or different, has been at the heart of the best practices project writ large for the past 16 or 17 years. Essentially, what best practices have done is they've said, we're going to take this core question about transformative use, and we're going to ask people in particular disciplinary communities, what are the sort of things that you need to do your work well? What's the stuff where you bring your own creativity and your own imagination and your own professional judgment in order to engage with the wider world and create something new? So talking to documentary filmmakers, talking to librarians and folks in my community, talking to educators in different fields, scholars in different fields, we've had these conversations and asked them, what's the work that you do and how does fair use fit with that in different ways? And sorry about that, the joys of working from home. So best practices have been a way of taking that information from different practice communities and gathering together the best practices. A good documentary filmmaker would do this. A professional ethical librarian would do that sort of thing. And so driven by this set of questions about how open educators can rely on fair use, we've developed this new code of fair practice that can help with some of the things we've articulated here: media literacy, language learning, the accessibility and durability conversations that I alluded to a moment ago. And that has led to the creation of this document, the Code of Best Practice and Fair Use, that I'm so excited about. So that's sort of the why of the code. Let's talk about what it is and a little bit about what it's not as well. The code can be used for a lot of different things, and we've seen other codes of best practice used very successfully for many of these things. And we've got a section on applying the code that sort of walks through this. One of the first things that the code has been really useful for is as a tool for copyright education in different ways. It's a way to help people go from what's fair use, or I'm a little intimidated by fair use, to, okay, I get that and I can apply that in my own context. So it can be, if I'm creating an OER, I can use it to understand the issues. And if I'm helping somebody else create an OER, I can use it to help them understand the issues as well. We also are very excited, and I'm going to talk some more about this in a little bit, about the opportunity to bring people into creating OER that have felt like they were excluded in the past. The conversations we've had with people who have said, I really want to create a great OER on film studies, but I've got to use clips from movies to do a good job with that. And the studios aren't going to give me permission to do that. I feel like I'm flummoxed. Those are the people we're especially excited to welcome in and say, good news, fair use is a tool that lets you do that work really, really well, really thoughtfully, and absolutely legally as well. The other set of stakeholders that we've thought about in terms of creating the code and that we're thinking about now in terms of distributing and using the code are the gatekeepers, are the people who often make the decision or stand in the way of the person who says, okay, I'm ready to make this OER, and maybe the librarian or the publisher who says, yeah, we're ready to, let's do it. The folks who ultimately can make a decision about institutional risk. So in my context, that's the Office of General Counsel. I can talk until I'm blue in the face about how great fair use is and how powerful it's going to be. If my Office of General Counsel says no, we've got a problem, right? So we hope that the codes are going to be a way to talk to folks like Offices of General Counsel and say, this is okay. This has been through a process that's well known and vetted. It's been considered and reviewed by some legal experts, and I'll talk about them in a minute. Relax, this is a good thing to do. And then likewise, we hope that courts similarly will be able to rely on this, as they've done in some other contexts as well, to sort of understand how fair use fits in this particular context. So that's the how to use it. I did want to take a minute also to talk about what it's sort of not. And And it is not these things, not because these aren't important things, but because there are other resources that already do this work. So the first thing the code is not is if you open this up and say, I really need to understand how to do course reserves or e-reserves, or I want to talk about controlled digital lending of material or that sort of thing. That's not what this is for. This is really about creating resources, open educational resources that people can use generally. There are complementary codes that talk specifically about fair use in course reserves, classroom use, and that sort of thing as well. And I'll point to the ARL code on academic and research libraries that specifically gets into those issues. It's also not a handbook on open licensing. The Creative Commons has a really great certificate on that I recommend. And then most importantly, what the code by design is not is a sort of cheat sheet, is the teacher's edition with all the answers in the back of the book, right? There are resources out there that purport to tell you, oh yeah, fair use is easy. 10%, that's the magic number, or 30 seconds, that's the magic number. And those resources that often give the illusion of certainty are out there for a reason. They can often make it easier for people to feel comfortable with something, but they are not the law itself. They don't reflect the way the law works. They reflect the way individual communities have tried to sort of operationalize the law, right? We know we should use the appropriate amount. We don't know what appropriate means. So let's say 10%. What the heck? That's not a magic number. That's just something one community identified. The code doesn't work that way because we think that illusion can be problematic in some cases. Instead, it describes a way of thinking through fair use. It's a process for making a decision in your own context. The last thing to say about what the code is not is that the code is not a sort of, charge the barricades, firebrand document. It's not a push the limits, expand our rights advocacy document. It's a very boring, down the middle centrist document in a lot of ways. What we did is we talked to a lot of people in the OER community and we identified the clearest, the strongest, the safest use cases that are most obvious. And in fact, when we talked with our panel of independent experts, what some of them said to us was, you could do a little more if you wanted, right? There's more fair use to be had than what you've described here. And we said, we know that, trust us, that's what we do day to day. But what we want to do is give people something that they can be rock solid certain about. So that if next year there's some new Supreme Court decision, the code doesn't sort of crumble away. And we've had several questions from people who have said, my institution is really risk averse. They're not comfortable walking up to the very edge of the line or walking on the thin ice. And we've been able to say to them, great, this document should be really reassuring for them, because this document is the safe middle ground. If there's a map of like stuff permitted by fair use, this is the very center of that map in a lot of ways. So just because the code doesn't say you can do it, doesn't mean you can't do it. But if the code says you can do it, you should feel very, very confident. This isn't some radical, brave, taking a risk sort of fair use. This is the boring bread and butter, middle of the diagram kind of stuff. Finally, I wanted to acknowledge and recognize the really, really smart people who provided external review for the code. The other reason I feel confident in saying this is a safe middle of the road document is we pulled people from a lot of different walks of life, a lot of different perspectives on copyright, we've got faculty members in here, we've got professors in here. Steve McDonald is a general counsel, and they all said to a person, dead on, this is exactly right, this is what you can do. And as I said a minute ago, this is the very safe middle sweet spot of what you can do. So if you don't take my word for it, or Peter or Meredith's or Prue's word for it, you can definitely take Karis and Sharon and Michael and Steve and Kevin and Rebecca and Laura's word for it. So again, that's sort of what the code is. Let's talk about now what the code says. The way this code works is the way that most codes work, which is we have identified a set of core principles. It is fair use to rely, or it is permitted under fair use to rely on fair use in this way. And this comes naturally from those conversations we had with people across the open education community. As we talk to people and ask them what a good open educator would do, what it looks like to really practice open education, they said to us over and over, good pedagogy, good open education happens when you comment or critique on something, for example. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. You take somebody else's argument and you push back on it. or you build on it, or you say, this is one example of how you might do something. Here's why it's effective. Here's why it's less effective. That's just what a good open educator does. So we identify a use case. Somebody says, I think commentary and critique are important to do educational work. So we state the use case, we state the principle. Fair use permits us to do that sort of commentary and critique. And then we offer a set of considerations in hard cases. The considerations are, be thoughtful about this piece of it. It's especially good practice to do it in this way. So for example, with commentary and critique, we might have said, make sure to be considerate about how much you use. If you say, I'm going to do commentary and critique, and you use a whole movie, well, maybe that's the appropriate amount, but consider the amount that you're using as well. And then finally, a set of hard cases as sort of an outer limit and a reminder that the code isn't a get out of jail free card that says like, yeah, just do whatever you want, wave the fair use flag and you can get away with it. This is specifically, this is a thing educators need to do. This is how fair use permits them to do it. They should be thoughtful about these issues, and they should look a little closer if they start to do this sort of stuff as well. So use case, principle, considerations, hard cases. Let's talk through those four use cases and then principles as well. The first one I've sort of already introduced you to. It's hard to imagine an easier question about fair use than the question of using inserts, stuff that you brought in from third parties, as objects of critique and commentary. If I saw that on a final exam in a law school class, I would smile a big smile. If somebody walked into my office and asked me this question, I'd smile that same big smile. This is explicitly something that fair use is for. The statute, the written law, calls out this use as an emblematic example of the reason we have fair use in the first place. So in this example here, this is a poem by E.E. Cummings. We're going to use it to critique and comment on the poetic technique being used in this context. That is the easiest slam dunkest case of fair use you could possibly ask for. So it was very easy for us to say to those folks in interviews and then to write in the code as well. When your OER is bringing in third-party materials as objects of critique and commentary, fair use supports what you're doing. Breathe easy. Keep doing that important stuff. Almost as easy, it's sort of hand in glove in some sense, is the context where you bring in an insert, not to critique it directly, but to illustrate something that's going on or something that's happening. So the example I have here that I like is a set of different robots from the movies, the famous robot from Metropolis, and then the robot from Star Wars as well. We're not necessarily critiquing the costume design or the use of colors. We're illustrating the way that Star Wars harkened back to old movies. We're illustrating the way robots are presented in film over time. That sort of use is just as powerful an example of fair use. Fair use just as clearly permits this sort of use and supports and encourages this sort of use. So again, the good pedagogy and the good legal practice line up very nicely in this context, as it will in all of the principles that I talk about. So commentary and critique, purposes of illustration. The third purpose is something that came out of our conversations that we heard over and over, and we were really interested to talk about more with people. Something that fair use is really good at supporting is incorporating content as learning resource materials when what you're doing is you're pulling in examples from the real world. So the scenario that we heard from a lot of people was, I'm a language educator, and I can make up sort of silly sentences for students to read and practice on. Je m'appelle Will, j'aime le chat, right? I can make up a silly French sentence to help people learn French at a basic level. But if I want my students to really understand how French or Spanish or whatever is spoken, I want them to engage with the real material that's out there in the world. So the example we have here is a Brazilian telenovela. A faculty member who said, I'm teaching people languages, and I want to bring in this telenovela as a way for them to see not just the artificial, made up, silly textbook sentence, but actually to try to do their language learning in the context of the real stuff that people who speak that language actually engage with. Fair use absolutely supports that behavior as well. That's the sort of thing fair use is really, really good at, incorporating content as learning resource materials in that way. You could imagine the same sort of fair use argument for somebody who says, I'm critiquing, or I'm having students think about journalism and how they write editorials, and I'm going to bring in a set of editorials and have them read those and understand them and analyze them in different ways as well, right? So engaging with the real world, the actual stuff that's happening, not just the made up silly example that I might create and openly license. That's the third principle that the code articulates. And then the final principle is one that we chewed on a little bit more, but I think we ended out on a really, really good place, which is we heard from a lot of people, there's already a textbook that has some pretty good materials out there, but it's out of print. Nobody will sell it to me. Nobody will license permission to me. What do I do in that context? Do I need to totally reinvent the wheel? And this one is interesting because often when I talk about fair use with OER, I say the one thing you can't do is just take two existing textbooks that are for sale and smush them together, right? That's the example a lot of us use when talking about the limits of fair use. But the case is a little bit different when you're working with materials that are no longer available in the marketplace in any sense. So I've got this example I really like here on the left, this book on modern nuclear technology from I think like the 1960s. You will not be surprised to hear that nuclear technology has changed a bit since the 1960s, and anybody using this modern nuclear technology book today would be doing their students a great disservice. As a result, the book is out of print. You can't buy it, you can't license it, you might find it in a secondhand store somewhere, but it's not commercially available in any sense. But you could imagine somebody saying the way the headings are sequenced and the introductions are presented, or some of the diagrams from this textbook are still really relevant and still really useful. I'd like to not have to recreate those diagrams, but just to pull that stuff from the out of print resource. And I've got another example here, the Spanish verb tenses chart, right? Here's a book from the 1930s that introduces the Spanish language. It's wildly culturally insensitive. It's tremendously out of date. I would never assign that textbook. The publisher would never print that textbook anymore. But gosh, those charts were really, really good. I'd like to pull those charts out. The fourth principle that we articulate, that we heard from the open educators we talked to, and that fair use pretty clearly permits, is when you repurpose especially pedagogical content like charts, graphs, those sorts of things, organizational structure as well, from existing educational materials that are not commercially available. That's the fourth area that fair use pretty clearly permits. So commentary and critique and analysis, illustration, stuff from the real world to be used for sort of immersive engagement in some sense, and then repurposing stuff that's no longer in commerce is the term that we would use sometimes. Those are the four major principles articulated in the code. So that's what the code says at its heart. Those are the principles that we articulated. The code has a lot of other good stuff to say as well that I want to gesture to quickly. And the first thing I want to say is that the number one thing we heard from educators that we spoke with was not about fair use explicitly. It was a concern that if I create something and slap an open license on it, and I include materials that I don't own copyright in, I could get somebody down. Somebody could see my textbook, see the open license, reproduce it, remix it, revise it, whatever, and get caught up because their fair use analysis looks different than mine. I don't want to set somebody else to get up in trouble in that way. And so the response to that, the thing that they talked about, and we sort of are reproducing from those conversations, were one, a similar use downstream is going to have a similar fair use analysis. If I make a textbook and then you make a textbook based on my textbook, the fair use analysis is pretty similar. But more than that, though, and more important than that, everybody to a person said, it's really important to mark instances where you rely on fair use, right? It's important to do attribution in every case because attribution is important, whether or not the law puts a premium on that. But also, if I bring in a video of a telenovela or a poem from E.E. Cummings or a chart from another textbook or whatever, it's really critical, along with that open license that you're putting on your OER, to make it clear this chart isn't mine. This telenovela is not openly licensed. I'm using it in reliance on fair use instead, so that downstream users, when they see that telenovela, will go, oh, I need to make my own fair use analysis about that particular piece of it, or just remove it if I don't really want it. And as I say, the analysis in similar uses is going to look pretty similar, but people can go in with their eyes open in that way. So again, participants agreed that was important. And exactly as it says here, because determinations are predictable in this context, the analysis is gonna look similar, but the marking felt very, very important to people. Everybody agreed on marking. Nobody agreed, though, on how to mark fair use inserts in different ways. And so we instead of picking a right answer, split the difference and said, it's important to mark in a way that your community will understand, that we get that an historian might do marking in a way that's different from a chemist, that's different from a nursing instructor, that's different from a K-12 instructor talking about literature or whatever it is. So we offer these three options for marking fair use in our open educational resources. The first is a simple indirect acknowledgement. In the same place where you put your Creative Commons license, this work is licensed CC BY, you include a statement that says something like, materials in this resource in some cases are included under fair use. So you say, be aware, as soon as I tell you that this is openly licensed, I also tell you at the same time to be aware of those fair use inclusions as well. And in some cases, that's really obvious, right? If I have a sentence where I'm talking about a topic and I quote somebody else and I put rabbit ears around it, as said by the great Peter Jaszi, blah, 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 fair use is a muscle. The quotation marks, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, say to somebody, I didn't write that, Peter did. That's why I put the quotation marks around it. So there are some disciplines where just saying something indirectly, anywhere you see quotation marks, you should assume that was used under fair use. I didn't get permission to quote that one sentence from that other person. So indirect acknowledgement is one option. The second option is direct acknowledgement. There are some cases where our OER creators felt like it was really important for a specific item to be labeled at the point of that item. So if I included a clip from a telenovela, as discussed earlier, I might say it feels important to me to have a specific thing below, wherever that telenovela is included that says, this thing specifically is included under fair use as described in the Code of Best Practice. Make no mistake, I'm going to say that directly about this thing. And then my suspicion is that more often than not, there will be some hybrid version of those two, where there's a general statement at the beginning acknowledging that we relied on the code in order to create this thing. And then in those specific moments where the item really calls out for direct acknowledgement, we add that to it as well. I wanted to note also that you might have noticed in each of the slides above, I've included examples of the way you might do that marking. So in this case, the chart and the image of the textbook are included on the basis of fair use as described in the code. That's not the only way to do it, but that's sort of a nice way to do it in that way. So marking was really, really important to us. The other thing that we wanted to spend some time in the document, and I wanted to take a second to gesture towards here as well, is there's a lot of adjacent material that we thought it was important for open educators to be aware of. And so we included it, and I'm gesturing to it now. We share a summary of what we found about OER and copyright in general. We share a nice overview of fair use law in the US, and that can be a nice way if you want to learn more about fair use, not just in this context there. And then the other sort of downstream use we spent a lot of time talking about was downstream use across national and legal borders, right? I feel totally confident in my fair use analysis. I don't know what Canadian law looks like. I don't want to set up my peers in Canada to get in trouble because they don't have fair use. And so we drafted a discussion about the similarities across national borders, right? There is this international right to quotation that harmonizes international law in a lot of ways. And then we had Professor Karis Craig, who is a big deal in terms of Canadian copyright law, write a specific section on the relationship between US and Canadian fair use and fair dealing law, because so many of our collaborations go across that border in particular. And because we love Karis and we'll ask her to write something any chance we get. So that's what's in the appendices. I encourage you to take a look at those if and when you rely on the code in different ways. And then I wanted to gesture quickly towards sort of the core values that we saw throughout the code, because we heard these explicitly from the people we talked to. We tried to weave them in, but we always try to surface them as often as we can as well. As I said a moment ago, attribution of sources and clear marking were really, really important. The law does not require either of those things, but I think good disciplinary practice does. So we wanted to say that out loud. Continuing to think about fair use as a tool for equity and accessibility. That's one of the reasons that the law exists in the first place. And so when you come to a particular situation and try to apply the law, really thinking, is this supporting equity and accessibility in different ways? If it is, you should feel good about your fair use claim, or better, at least, about your fair use claim. And if it does, if the answer that you're getting diminishes equity and accessibility, it doesn't mean you're wrong, but it means you should take a closer look. And then finally, a lot of conversations came up related to the question of linking out. Some people initially said, I don't really feel like I need to rely on fair use for third-party materials. I'll just put a link in there and that'll be okay, that'll be enough. A lot of other people were quick to remind us, and so we were happy to be reminded that linking out has a lot of disadvantages. And those disadvantages are, in one sense, universal, right? Link rot is a problem for everybody. There was just a really great study on, I believe it was materials linked in Supreme Court opinions and the New York Times were the two that I saw recently. And the numbers were staggering, the number of broken links and stuff that you just can't find anymore. So if you want your textbook to be resilient, to persist over time, linking out is often a problem. More than that, though, linking out creates a disproportionate burden to students who have challenges around accessibility and access, right? A link out to a third-party site, sometimes a link goes to YouTube, and the stuff you see on a YouTube site can be, maybe best case is just distracting, sometimes downright disturbing in some different senses. It also, and more importantly, puts the burden on the student who needs some sort of accommodation to solve that problem for the linked out material, right? We can make our textbooks fully accessible, but if I link out to a resource that's somewhere else on the web, they may not have made that resource accessible, and so we're placing that burden on the students. So I want to suggest that linking out might not be the panacea that some people have suggested it felt like to them in some cases. So I see there are a couple of questions in chat I'm going to look at. Okay, great questions about the materials and the presentation and then the code itself. Thank you for adding those things. Those are really helpful. And I am doing pretty well. I think we're going to have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion, as I hoped. Very quickly, before we jump into those questions, I wanted to say a few things about applying the code in your specific community. I want to suggest that there are a few immediate ways to start using the code right now, and we've heard from some folks who are already using the code in this capacity. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some opportunities that we've been lucky enough to get some funding to be doing that we're going to be talking with the community about as well. The first is, at my own institution, I've already had some great conversations about updating our practices internally. I've raised my own confidence about how fair use works in this place. I have engaged with obviously a lot of trainings and like this webinar. I've led some and I've attended some as well. And then I've started some conversations with folks on my campus to think about how can we change our practices? What are no's that we can turn into yeses? What are maybes that we want to dig into a little more deeply as well? We can use the code to change our own practice internally. We've also had some really great conversations about using the code to create new open educational resources. I talked a minute ago about the sort of the lost textbooks, the textbooks that haven't been able to have been created in the past. I think that's really, really important in terms of inviting new stakeholders and covering new areas and topics. There's also a really strong opportunity to use the code to take an existing open educational resource and make it better. To say all of the images in this text are of a certain type of person, and we'd like to bring in images that are more reflective of the community that we hope will be using this resource, right? We can not just create new stuff, we can make existing stuff better in reliance on fair use. There are also some great and I think important opportunities to improve institutional policy in different ways. If you are the copyright guide or gatekeeper in your context, great news. I hope you'll read the code. If you have questions, I hope you'll talk to us. If you're not the gatekeeper though, talking to those folks and saying, there's this new thing you might have heard of. We think it can really help us do the open education stuff we're excited about better, more powerfully. Start that conversation and update your policy as well. We're setting up at least one, maybe several webinars with the NACUA, which is the big Office of General Counsels in a lot of institutions of higher education. So my hope by doing that is that when you reach out and start that conversation, you'll be starting it with somebody who's already heard something about this resource. So we're going to try to get them from both sides. So the people who are making decisions about copyright and fair use are familiar with and conversant with what this resource does and how it can help out in the work that we're doing. So that's what we can each do as individuals. In terms of next step, last week we got some nice news from IMLS. We got some funding, and that funding is going to help us do a couple things over the next couple of years. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to support a specific set of projects where a new open educational resource is created or an existing highly used open educational resource is significantly improved. We're just going to reach out to communities like foreign language learning and nursing and those sorts of areas and say, what's the missing textbook in your context? What's the thing that you can create? We're going to give them some support to create that resource within their own community. And we're going to ask them to share out, this is what we're going to do at the beginning, to share out information as they're doing the work. We're going to host some webinars and some events and blog posts and that sort of thing, where they just talk about, started using the code, this part went great, this part was really challenging. And then at the end, we're going to ask them to compile everything they've learned and release that as almost sort of an adjunct to the code itself that says, this is what the code looks at 5,000 feet. This is how these principles apply in the context of foreign language learning, in the context of chemistry education, in the context of X, Y, and Z. So we're going to create some new, or we're going to support the creation of some new OER, and we're going to create the sort of the lessons learned document during and then at the end of that work, so that people within that community can have more specific targeted guidance, and so that other communities can sort of see analogies as well. In addition to that, we're going to be developing some training on the use of the code, a little bit more of a deep dive on how to use it in your own context and how to teach other people about it as well, some train the trainer stuff. And I'm excited to be part of that work as well. If any of the things that I have said so far have sparked your imagination, have gotten you excited or curious or angry and furious or whatever it is, you can reach out to us at this form and say, I'm part of a community that's always dreamed about writing this textbook. Let's talk. Or I'm still really confused about the code. I'd like to find a way to be connected to that training, or whatever it is we can do to help take the code from this thing that we help facilitate the creation of into actual practices and materials that are created. That's what we're going to be doing over the next 2 years or so. And so I hope you'll reach out to us with your ideas, questions, inspirations, and that sort of thing. I did pretty well. We have about 8 minutes left to talk, and I'm not in a rush, so I'm happy to hang a little longer if needed. What did I say too fast? What did I say that was confusing? What did I say that got you excited? What do you want to talk about?
Well, thank you so much for sharing this wonderful resource. If anybody has questions, feel free to unmute yourself. We can speak out loud or share them in the chat. I'm happy to be the moderator and share those questions out. I took so many pages of notes already just from this, and wanted to share my thanks in that this is going to be so beneficial to smaller and less resourced institutions. And you talked about that equity gap. And just I've worked in smaller institutions in my entire career, and just to know that, you know, we don't always have that system network of experts that we can rely on. So to be able to have this as a resource is absolutely fantastic. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you so much for saying that. I think that's a really, really good point, that we talk about equity in terms of who's represented in the book and that sort of thing. But the opportunity for more institutions, even if they can't afford to have a full-time lawyer on staff to create and share out, that's really, really exciting and really, really important. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I always try to bring in that little guy voice to the conversation, and thanks those who are able to do that work. We have a comment from Karen just saying, thank you so much. It was so helpful and encouraged to share the information with others. I noted the same thing, just in terms of having the recording available and those types of things. I have a whole group of people I want to share that with at my institution so that we can kind of band together. And I think your presentation really does speak to our theme of building those bridges. This is nothing if not building that bridge between, you know, traditional copyright and the open licensing and that gray area of fair use in between, and also the large community of voices and experts that went into building your best practices. Each slide I was thinking, man, they really did their research.
Thank you. It's so nice to hear.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions they want to voice or comments or kudos for Will?
I'll if people are thinking, I'll raise a question and then answer that question that we've heard sometimes when we talk with people. I think when you hear fair use permits you to do something, some people hear the follow on, so you should do that. And some people have pushed back and said, there are times when maybe the law says I can do it, but it feels inappropriate to use that material. That's sensitive to that person, or that's a use that feels disrespectful. And so I wanted to say out loud, the only thing the lawyers can answer is what you are permitted to do. What other people can answer is what is the best pedagogical decision, what's the best decision in terms of equity and inclusivity and respect for different communities and community knowledge and that sort of thing as well. Our great hope with this resource is that people will have as many legal options to choose from so that they can make the best choice in terms of pedagogy, in terms of equity. So this is presented in a way that talks about those issues some, but I want to say that it's designed to be a tool that permits you to center those other, I'd argue, much more important questions about pedagogy and representation and inclusivity and that sort of thing as well. So I hope anybody who's watching this will hear what we mean to say loud and clear, which is that stuff is the most important stuff. And what the code does is it pushes the not as important legal uncertainty out of the way so that you can center what you ought to be able to center and what the law is telling you you should be able to center, which is, how do I think teaching happens best? How do I think learning happens best?
Yeah, that really the using your gut and what what feels right on top of just because the law says you can. It's sometimes a dichotomy there, isn't it? Especially when, if you're saying, wanting to bring more voices in and expose people to different things. If you're able to work directly with creators and provide them compensation to create something on your behalf, or be creative in that, it seems like it opens up the world of possibilities as well, in addition to just saying what can I do with the existing content, but it may also open up the possibility for collaboration with new creators that you may not have really felt that you were able to be exposed to. So we have a question from Raven. When creating the code, did the team consider potential contractual barriers like terms of service that might bar users that would otherwise be fair?
That's a really good question. We talked some about the sort of adjacent legal issues, and we gesture towards like patents and trademark and that kind of thing, mostly just to say, don't worry about that stuff. It's hard to imagine a use in a textbook that would raise any trademark issues, for example. If you're writing a book about marketing and you want to use the Golden Arches as an example, no trademark issues there. The terms of use thing is interesting. Oftentimes, when you're dealing with third-party materials, the terms of use might not be binding on you. For example, if you and I have an agreement with terms of use and a third person wants to use something, that may or may not be a contract that they have signed. But that's certainly something to keep in mind is when and how terms of use might limit use in different ways, especially in terms of getting access to thing in the first place. So that, yeah, that's something we talked about some, and there's no silver bullet for that. But yeah, our hope is that doesn't sort of rear its head too much. And of course, all of us in library land have people who spend a lot of time sweating the details of whether the license does or does not foreclose fair use in that way. So it's a really good question that I don't have a great answer to, but it's a good one.
A follow-up statement from Raven saying, I frequently see faculty members who want to use screenshots in their OER or online courses, and the terms of those websites bar reproduction of that content. So that's a specific comment, I guess, related to that too.
Yeah, I'd be interested as to whether those terms of use are binding or not. Unless you're clicking through something, like if I just go to a website on the open web, the terms of use probably aren't binding on me in the first place. And I think there's a question in terms of public policy as well there. So that's not a non-existent issue. But I think people often assert the ability to keep you from doing things beyond their actual legal ability to prohibit you from doing things. And I suspect some of those terms of use fall into that category.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So Jonathan has a question. Tactical question. Campus attorneys are often very risk averse. Any suggestions about how to deal with them when they want to just shy away from fair uses that you promote, saying, sure, Will and his colleagues are lawyers, but they're not our lawyers?
That's a great question. And it's an evergreen question for sure. I think you can reassure them that, right, I spent some time talking about how this is sort of the middle of the chart. This isn't the edge case. We hope that will be reassuring. I think it's really important that we be having these conversations at the NACUA level for General Counsel's office, for example, so that when peers ask each other these questions, they can be reassured by that. The thing that I have said to my counsel's office when, if they ask that question is, there are companies that rely on these codes of best practice in order to do their work. Documentary filmmakers can get errors and omissions insurance because those errors and omissions insurers rely on the codes of best practice. The case of Morano versus the Met this year, a court explicitly relied on the codes of best practice and fair use in order to reach a decision that the use in this context was fair. So the more we use this stuff, the easier it is to say, this isn't just some harebrained scheme some radical law professor somewhere had, that there are people making business decisions that have decided it makes business sense to rely on these codes in this way. There are courts making legal decisions that have relied on the code in this way as well. But to your point, Jonathan, I think when their peers in counsel's offices or attorney general's offices, attorney's general office or whatever, that's when you're going to see the real changes. If you can say, right, if you're talking to your counsel's office and you tell them, call Sean Troxler at NC State. NC State relies on the code. Ask Sean what he thinks. You don't have to talk to Will. He's a crazy leftist or whatever. Sean is very stodgy and very conservative. He totally supports the codes. Talk to him about that stuff. I think there's no substitute for that sort of peer marketing and endorsement in that sense. So we can talk about, courts have upheld it and businesses rely on it, but until their peers agree, I think that's going to be the real sea change. As the first and second of us do this, it'll be easier for the third and fourth and fifth as well. So this is, right, Peter's old saw is that fair use is a muscle, that if you use it, it gets bigger and stronger. And if you don't use it, it sort of atrophies away. So one of the reasons that we're going to create these examples of resources created with the code is we think that's going to be our calisthenics with fair use in that sense. So you can say, here are 5 resources built using it. They haven't been sued. Everything seems great, etc. So that's the work we're doing and the work we want to make it really easy for you all to do as well.
That seems
and
like
I see we're a few minutes over time, so thanks for hanging out with me. I'm going to shut up now and not stand in the way of lunch because
it's okay. It's quite all right. I wanted to say on behalf of the committee that planned this conference, thank you so much for sharing this resource and your wisdom. And we're so grateful for all of the information that you shared with us today. And everyone, big hand for Will. And if anyone wants to continue the conversation, feel free to log into the Lunch Network and we can keep talking about what a great resource this is and how we're all going to put it into practice and share it across our institutions so that we can open up that universe of content.
Yes, thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time and enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day and we'll see you all at future sessions.
Yes.